Okay, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Dean's Advisory Committee, I'd like to welcome you here to the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara for this conversation today on drought in California. Just as a matter of housekeeping a little bit, there is actually an overflow room next door in 1424 for those of you that are seated on the steps here. If you wanted to go into the next room, there's a live feed there. And for anybody that shows up later on, maybe you can direct them next door if need be. Also, we're going to have a couple questions to start it off, but then we're going to open it up to everyone here, and we'll be passing the mic around. So just be sure that if you do ask a question that you speak directly into the mic. This is being recorded, and so that would help us a lot with capturing the audio for that. So I'll just kind of get things started here. An understanding of how we use water, where we get it, and at what cost is critical to coping with water scarcity today and planning for the management of our water resources in the future. The choices we make with water, both as individuals and as a society, have implications for our environment, our economy, and our own health and livelihoods. We are fortunate at the Bren School to have a number of esteemed experts on water science and technologies, economics, policy, and law, all under one roof, and today we are lucky enough to bring some of them together to discuss and explore this very relevant topic. We have with us Arturo Keller. Professor Keller teaches here at the Bren School and holds a joint appointment in mechanical engineering at UCSB. He is the Associate Director of the UC Center for the Environmental Implications of Nanotechnology. And his research and teaching interests focus on water quality management, the fate and transport of pollutants in the environment, and water technologies. Gary Libecap. Professor Libecap is the Professor of Corporate Environmental Management at the Bren School, as well as Professor of Economics in UCSB's Economics Department. Dr. Libecap holds high-level appointments at several top institutions around the country, and his current research is focused on the legal, economic, and policy impacts of water allocation in the western United States. Jim Salzman. Professor Salzman holds appointments as the Samuel F. Mordecai Professor of Law at Duke Law School and as the Nicholas Institute Professor of Environmental Policy at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, as well as his position as a visiting professor with us at the Bren School, where he teaches environmental law and natural resource law. Professor Salzman is also the author of the book, Drinking Water, A History. And also we have Bob Wilkinson. Professor Wilkinson is a policy expert whose research and teaching has focused on water and energy policy, climate change, and issues of environmental policy. He also serves on the Public Advisory Committee for California's State Water Plan and is the co-author of a recently released report entitled Achieving a Sustainable California Water Future Through Innovations in Science and Technology. Please welcome this panel. So now I just wanted to give just a couple stats, little background to kind of set the stage here. California receives 3/4 of its annual precipitation between November and March, the majority from December through February. So we're in May, which means we're going to have a while here without any precip. About 75% of the demand for water in California originates south of Sacramento, although 75% of the water supply in the state comes from north of Sacramento. Of the developed water in the state, water that is to say water that has been gathered behind dams, pumped from the ground, and transmitted through pipes and aqueducts, about 80% of its use goes to the state's farms, with the remainder to the urban populations and industrial needs. So this year, on January 17th, Governor Jerry Brown declares a state of drought emergency. On April 18th, the Cal Department of Water Resources announced an increase from 0 to 5% in the state water project water delivery allocation for the remainder of the year. This will be the lowest state water project allocation since deliveries began in the 1960s. In the May 1st snow report, just a few days ago, the statewide snowpack, which provides about 1/3 of the water for California's farms and cities, is at 18% of average for the date. Most of our state's reservoirs are currently at about half of their average levels, and we are currently under stage 1 state drought conditions, which calls for voluntary conservation from everyone and asks us to reduce water use by 20% or more wherever possible. So I am not a native Californian. I've been reading a lot about the statistics, just gave you a few of them right now. It sounds like a very serious situation. But apart from reading about the severity of the drought, in what ways have you witnessed the impacts of the drought to yourselves or others in California? Which is to say, as a non-native to California, it sounds like it's such a big problem right now. But in my life, so far in the last few months, I haven't actually witnessed that much of an impact on anything that I've been doing or anything that I've been seeing around. So I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe your history with drought in the state, or just what you've observed recently and how that may or may not be different from years past.
Start with me?
Whoever wants to go.
All right, I'll jump in, but before I do that, Jim, let me just note my appreciation, I think all of ours, for your setting this up. This was your initiative, and we really appreciate the fact that Jim's heading out of here into a midterm exam, so it's not like he needed more things to do. But I really appreciate your initiative here, so thank you, Mr. Bond.
You're welcome.
You're starting with a good question. What difference does it make? For a lot of us, nothing at all right now, so far. And I think that's part of the issue. We are slow to react institutionally, officially, even though we see an issue. So whereas you see shifts in gasoline prices reflected up on those boards at the stations day by day that reflect some scarcity, or interest rates moving up and down, water prices, water policy is very slow lag between dry years and then what we do about it. So far, some communities are moving into mandatory restrictions, but many are not. There are cutoffs for some agricultural areas so far, but really you don't see that much yet. If we go another year, we'll be talking much more serious reactions to it. But many communities are saying they've got at least 2 years right now of water supply, so don't worry. A different message might be careful, we may need that, and so the message is mixed. Others are in pretty short-term trouble. Montecito indicated it had 2 months of water supply, but cutting back on irrigating lawns wasn't really an appealing option. So Montecito's got a challenge to sort through. Santa Barbara has challenges to sort through, Goleta, but this is the case throughout the state.
Everyone else's mic.
Well, I wanted just to, since I'm an economist and I didn't talk about prices, there would be a real mistake. So Bob made reference to the fact that none of us, or at least here, are getting very strong signals about impending shortages or likely impending shortages. If we were dealing with a commodity market, all of this would be wrapped up in prices, and it would be gradually, those prices would be moving up, behavior would be changing in response to those changes in prices, and those prices would incorporate more immediate as well as longer term supply and demand conditions. But water just is not priced in that way. Locally, it's priced by utilities, and those prices vary dramatically. And then across the state, water does not trade very easily, so there aren't sort of readily developed or smooth ways in which water can move from one use to another. And so as a consequence, prices don't get generated from those transactions. So as a consequence, unless there's some arbitrary actions such as the reduced flows across the Sacramento Delta, there is no signal to users about impending shortages either this year or next.
So, I mean, one way to think about this also is water has very different meanings depending on who the users are, who the parties are. So, for example, if you're a farmer, water has different meaning than if you are an industry, than if you are a municipality, than if you're an individual consumer. So to a certain extent, Jim's question would have more meaning if we had different, if we had different sort of sectors. up here as well. I'm the drinking water guy. And so from that perspective, drinking water actually is the last thing we'll notice any difference, because drinking water is the most important use of water from a human perspective, and it's really a trickle in terms of the overall volume of water. And so one thing to think about is not simply the effect on us, but which users are going to be affected in which order.
I think one thing that's important is that we need to think about, as you were pointing out, the different ways that we use water. And we tend to think a lot about the drinking water, which turns out to be just a couple liters a day. So it's not all that much. I mean, we could save there, but it's not going to make a big impact. Then the water we use for washing ourselves, washing our clothes, washing our foods, still significant, but not the most important one. Then we have irrigation of lawns, parks, and all. That's much bigger. And then you go into the foods we eat, and that's where we can actually make the biggest impact by shifting the types of food we eat. When we eat beef that requires a lot of irrigation for getting a pound of beef, that's a big impact when you make a change like that. So the changes may have to be in other commodities, not necessarily just the water. No? Mm-hmm. But again, you need the price signals to make those changes.
Do you think that there's a way to kind of bridge that value of water among the different sectors? I mean, can we find a way such that it is equally valued or similarly valued? Or what are the drivers with that discrepancy right now?
There's a very famous book about natural resources law by a guy called Wilkinson. It teaches the University of Colorado, and he talks about the lures of... Another Wilkinson. And he talks about the lords of yesteryear, how natural resource law and policy really was determined in many ways 100 years ago. And that's nowhere clearer than in water, where conceptually we can think of all kinds of ways that we could change allocations and priorities, but you've got this system of water rights. And that really, I was trying to think of the right. It's not really an elephant. It's more like I was trying to think of a sort of a hippo. It's kind of a water. It's a hippo in the room. It's a water beast, and that has to be dealt with. And that, my sense is, and again, you all know more about California than I do. My sense is that really is what drives a lot of this.
So I'll step in defense of water rights, even historical water rights. I don't see those as the impediment so much as the lack of a trading platform to move water from one use to another. If the rights are well defined, then people have something to trade.
Yeah.
If they're not defined, then there's no clear trader, and they don't know what they're trading, and you don't know what you're buying. So back to Jim's question, for example, in the Northern Colorado Conservancy District, which is a section of naturally northern Colorado, water trades routinely in small amounts, large amounts, whatever, between agricultural uses and urban uses. Cities often buy water or lease water in advance of use and then just leave it in the farm, with the idea being they can draw upon it if a dry period appears. And so in those cases, ag and urban values are very similar because it's a very active water market. That's just not true in most of the West, and in California in particular. Water just does not trade as smoothly, and that would be, it seems to me from a policy point of view, a way to devote state resources to figure out what it is that impedes water transfers, and how might we smooth that process. Because back to Arturo's point about shifting production, agricultural production, many farmers, irrigators, would be quite delighted to trade water, especially marginal water, because it's relatively low value to them. And they could get much higher value than the crops or whatever that they're producing from that water. They wouldn't sell all water, but they would sell this marginal water. So I think that that's sort of a first order area for policy to consider.
I'd agree with all that, and I'll pick up another point, though, on pricing. We've pretty systematically distorted pricing of water, starting with externalizing a lot of costs. So our water rights systems, to Jim's point, were crafted and implemented without regard to the impact on ecosystems, fisheries, and so forth for well over 100 years. So it's fully legal to dewater rivers and to do in the fish. After that, experience, we decided maybe there were some values that were important. We should do something about this. And in the 1960s and 70s, we implemented some laws saying maybe we should do something about endangered species and so forth. That changed the calculus. So a lot of the costs that we see now, the prices that we see now are not including the costs of externalized impacts. They're also heavily distorted with subsidies. And that doesn't mean subsidies are all bad, but it is important to look at what is driving the price tag on a unit of water. And I think coupled to everything Gary just went over, if willing buyers and willing sellers could move water back and forth, and if we could resolve some of the distortions in those markets, we probably could see a lot of transfers. But having said all that, there's still limits to the resource, and we're proceeding as if there really aren't any limits. We'll just go over the next mountain range, get some more. Even now, we're getting proposals, gee, let's just go up to Oregon and Washington. How about Alaska? The same ideas that were put forward 50 years ago in earnest, and just get some more, kind of a supply-side approach. Generally, the costs of those ideas are prohibitive anyway, but it's a shift in thinking that there is a limited amount of the resource, and we need to rethink how we allocate that resource. But that actually goes right back to what Gary was just talking about. That would be a mechanism to reallocate it to get more bang for the buck or crop for the drop or whatever the goal is.
There you go.
So how much, on the scale of things, we're clearly water is scarce in times of drought. How much water can be saved through economic measures as opposed to what are the needs for developing that supply? So whether we use new technology with desal or the toilet to tap, or is it really a market-driven thing? If we can figure out some of the institutional and legal barriers, maybe that's the solution.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, those are linked, because whether desal or toilet to tap is going to make economic sense depends on the price of water. And so, you know, I gather Santa Barbara built a desal plant and mothballed it in 1992 and sold its equipment to Saudi Arabia. So they got the shell.
Kind of, sort of.
Right.
And so, I mean, desal has, you know, you think desal is the answer, right? Because, I mean, there's a lot of ocean water, but you've got problems of energy. You've either got to boil the water and distill it, or you've got to, through reverse osmosis, shove it through these filters. You got to put the brine somewhere, right? So that's going to be a waste stream. And you got to move water, right? So if you're along the coast, that's fine, but if you're inland, that can get really expensive. And there are permitting processes. There's some NIMBY issues as well. Last I checked, area along the coast in California was pricey. And so being able to site it would be an issue as well. That said, there's a lot of, and of course, you know, with the energy, the climate change aspect as well, there's a lot of really interesting technological developments happening in the desal area. I mean, that's an area with a lot of innovation right now. And so I wouldn't be surprised 15, 20 years from now, things look very different on that score.
We don't like to use toilet to tap. That terminology was not very successful.
I did that to try to elicit
So
some
nowadays we
thoughts from
talk
the
more
crowd.
about reusing water, reclaiming water, some other ways of getting it too. But there is a lot of potential. I mean, you can actually get water to be of sufficient quality for many, many uses. And many communities have gone in that direction. Orange County has a lot of that going on. They go through the groundwater aquifer as their storage mechanism, and also to provide, you know, enough time for viruses and other pathogens to be out of that water. And there's many other opportunities to use that water for industrial applications, for many, many other applications back into agriculture and crops where you can do that. So I think we need to think about how we do that and make the long-term investments that are needed for that based on some of these, you know, by raising the price of water, then you can perhaps use that for the infrastructure that's needed. No? So I think that's a big component. Desal, I would say, as a lower option because that's more your backstop. That you should have only for your real crisis, but not as your primary way of providing water. So.
Should the burden of who saves water be related to the percentage of who uses water? So I mentioned at the beginning that 80% of the developed water is used by ag, but these desal plants and other technologies are probably going to be picked up by your urban centers. So I was just wondering if you had thoughts on how, the equity of water use and water cost and how that gets filtered around to the different sectors.
I'd frame it a little differently, actually. And by the way, we call it showers to flowers now.
There we go, that's it. Showers to flowers, there you go.
If in the urban water use, it is about 20% of the developed water in California, if we can cost effectively improve efficiency, then we should do it anyway, regardless of what agriculture is doing or anyone else. And that is indeed the case. I'm working on a study right now in response to the drought, and it looks like we could go on the order of 50% improvement in urban areas at current cost effectiveness. That's fixing leaks, changing plumbing fixtures, a lot of outdoor irrigation improvements. So we've got a long way to go. That's within cost effectiveness. We're recycling right now about 10 to 15% of the water in California, the showers to flowers. A lot of that's oil refineries irrigating this campus. About 90% of the water used to irrigate the campus is recycled. We can do a lot more of that. As Arturo says, we can also recharge groundwater basins, and some areas have been doing that for decades. They've been doing it very well, protecting public health. In fact, those systems far exceed the largest desal plant in North America that's under construction right now in San Diego. That's at about 50 million gallons a day when it gets started, and we're looking at Orange County going from 70 million gallons a day up to 100 million gallons a day, just that one area for groundwater recharge for reuse, and they've been doing it very well. So there's a huge potential, and even if we cut down water use in the urban system by half, we'd still be able to easily triple the amount of water we could recycle. So we can go both directions. Now, can we do more in agriculture too? Yes. We can do a lot, everything from conveyance to on-farm applications to soils. So there are a lot of things we can do. And then it gets into crop shifting, as Arturo mentioned, and thinking harder about what we do, where, and a lot of that ties back into the price signals.
I would disagree a little bit with Bob in the sense that I wouldn't decouple the value of water across different uses, especially in agriculture and urban, because frankly, without knowing what the value or the price of water at the margin is in agriculture, we don't know if some desal plant or conservation effort in an urban area is cost effective relative to the alternative of shifting more water out of ag to urban. That might be the low-cost way to do things. There are some sort of third-party effects as we increase efficiencies. For example, in water, if we improve irrigation technologies so that farmers, in a sense, waste less water when they put water on the land and more of it is actually consumed in production. It does mean that less water percolates down to groundwater or back to streams. So in a sense, that increases the consumptive use of any particular water right, and that actually could reduce groundwater recharge or flows to streams. So there are a lot of complications with this, but as Jim pointed out, water is pretty special in all sorts of ways. So this isn't an easy issue to address.
And realize as well the broader context this is taking place in. And to a certain extent, the water infrastructure is no different than bridges and roads. There's this huge, and water treatment plants, there's a huge backlog of work that needs to be done. And some of the cities in the East Coast are using water pipes that were laid right after the Civil War, literally. And I don't know about the situation in California, but certainly along a lot of cities in the East and Midwest, they're losing 10 to 20% of their water simply in distribution. I don't know if it's similar.
Oh, yeah.
About, yeah.
How does the environment then factor into the equation when we're looking at the allocation of water, especially in times of drought? Because we have needs, agriculture has needs, and it seems like the environment will often get kind of kicked down the road a little bit. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
It's been tough. We get to a point, and this is fairly typical, we did this in the drought in the 70s and the drought in the late 80s to 90s. It's fish versus people in the rhetoric. You see the protests and the signs, and indeed we have relaxed, weakened, set aside some of the provisions under the Endangered Species Act, state and federal in California. So it's a difficult situation, and critters and ecosystems do suffer under these circumstances. The sad thing to me is that it doesn't seem necessary. I mean, some of the ideas of the transfers that Gary's talking about, some of the efficiency options, especially if we could think ahead a bit. So in year 2 of a drought, year 3 of a drought, we're kicking in certain measures instead of waiting until there's kind of a crisis point, freaking out, and then having a political upset. And, you know, who wins and who loses? The fish don't have pockets, so they don't have the money to pay their way out. And, you know, they do, and they are right now suffering. We have a heroic effort right now to truck fish back and forth in Northern California, and it's kind of a last-ditch effort, but it tells you how expensive and how difficult the circumstances can get for the environment.
The most critical conditions from a water quality perspective and an ecosystem and the habitat perspective are the low flow conditions. So that's, you know, we're exacerbating that in these periods, not only because of the fact that there's a drought, which is a natural process, but the fact that now we've taken all this water out of the system, and so that's a big factor, and it will be very significant.
It would be, I think, a good thing to talk about some success, given that we're fairly on the negative side of things here, given that it is a drought. But this isn't so much in California, but although to some degree it's taking place. But for example, in Oregon, people like you are working with the Freshwater Trust, which used to be called Oregon Water Trust, to lease water from irrigators at specific times during the year to increase stream flow, so that water level, critical flow levels are maintained and water temperatures are maintained. And so the way this works is that they'll reach agreement with a particular irrigator, and then in August, when the value of irrigation often is relatively low or lower, the water is instead released into the stream, which is also the same time that the stream levels in the west are at their lowest and temperatures are at their highest, and it puts aquatic habitat at stress. That's, on the other hand, it's been very hard for this trust to kind of build momentum, because there's a lot of distrust between irrigators and the environmental community, so it takes a long time to get over that and have irrigators willing to engage in this process. But especially if you focus on small tributaries, in this case to the Columbia and the Willamette, they've just had remarkable levels of success in terms of maintaining stream flow. So I think it's worthwhile in a discussion like this to realize that there are success stories and there are ways to deal with things in a kind of voluntary, and this is set up now. So it's a process that in years of critical drought, these lease options kick in. In other places, when it's a wet year, they don't kick in. So it's a mechanism along that Bob was mentioning that adds to flexibility in response to drought.
So I think at this point I'd like to kind of open it up a little bit and have the dialogue out into the crowd, have a conversation here. So does anybody have any questions? Let me bring them up to you.
Thanks. So lots of people here in California really have their fingers crossed that this coming winter will be an El Nino year and we'll get lots of precipitation. So I'm wondering how those considerations play in for people that are interested in promoting conservation and efficiency now.
It's getting tough, actually. There is a certain segment that says, it's going to rain next year, we really don't have to do much. And others saying, look, this is really about sustainable water management. This is something Arturo's been talking about since the rest of us even got here at Bren. And if you think long-term, permanent, sustainable strategies, then you're clearly going to want to use water efficiently. Still do what you want to do in terms of meeting people's needs and having a profitable, vibrant agriculture, but do it in ways that is sustainable over the long term. So it's a trick. Now, right now we are setting up, all the indications so far are toward an El Nino. That doesn't guarantee we'll get a wet year, but we could. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. My hope is that we get some groundwater law in place. There's very serious efforts right now in Sacramento to move forward on groundwater management. First time for California. It's only a third of our water supply. We're only a $2 trillion economy, but maybe it's important to think about it. Get something going. So, if we can maintain momentum on good long-term strategies, regardless of whether it's a wet year or a dry year, that's going to put us ahead. There are some silver linings in this. So, week after next, my water class is planning to go up Owens Valley, Mono Lake, look at that system. I just learned this morning that they just opened Tioga Pass because there's no snow. So we're going to get to go up over and see Tuolumne Meadows and Hetch Hetchy on the trip. So there's a benefit to all this.
Mr. Sunshine. And one of the aspects of this, as well, and Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's first chief of staff, said never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's essentially, I think, the heart of your question. And it ties into what Bob's saying, which is that makes this particular legislative session particularly important. And they're always going to, it's human nature to try to push off pain and hard decisions saying, well, my leg may grow back or whatever. But, it's a question of how long you can do that.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is, from my limited perspective on water issues, it looks to me that like this whole state water project and draining water out of the Colorado River is actually, doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's that thing of like taking resource where there really isn't one and draining it. And I just wondered what your opinions are on that whole system and in the long term for sustainability, if you have any comments about that, and also about rainwater harvesting and gray water use at a lot level, or at a business, or rainwater harvesting in terms of there's curb cut stuff that there's a lot of resistance to in Santa Barbara right now of capturing stormwater when we get it, but and shifting to natives and where you think that might fit into the picture.
Start with that one?
I'll start with that one, the rainwater harvesting. I mean, I think it's a great idea, and we've had projects at the Bren School where we've gotten other communities to work on rainwater harvesting. It's tough when you don't have rain, which, it certainly makes it a challenge. So I think the second option that you were mentioning, the landscaping, is a really important one, because I think we need to shift, and I think Santa Barbara has done a lot, but there's still quite a bit more that can be done, shifting to landscapes and the types of native plants that are much more appropriate for that. And to think about not just rainwater harvesting, but gray water, it's a big challenge to actually get a gray water system permitted legally here in California. You can get it done, and you can sort of have connections which allow you to do that. But that's another possibility. In fact, that's a lot more water that could keep your landscaping running for quite a bit longer. It's year-round compared to the rainwater, which even under the best conditions, Jim was mentioning, we get 2-3 months of rain, but it's actually not 3 months of rain, it's 10 storms. And so our options here for capturing that water are really limited, and the investment may not be there. I mean, whatever we can do is great, but it's not worth to make a huge investment in rainwater harvesting.
In Colorado?
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
Well, we have a Colorado system, the Colorado River Aqueduct, which I think is what you're referring to, bringing water into urban Southern California. We also have a huge amount of water that predates that flows by gravity down through the Imperial Valley. And that's the biggest use in California of Colorado River water. But that's both of those systems and the State Water Project were built before we had the California Environmental Quality Act, before NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, so before we had to do impact analysis and so forth. We'd probably do things a bit differently, or at least think about them differently now if we were to contemplate those. But both of those were also designed to be supplemental water for California, not the mainstay, and that's kind of shifted through time. It is important to look at, right here on the South Coast, we do have a connection to state water, but it's a small fraction of what we take. It ranges from 0 to maybe 20%. Right now it's closer to the 0 side, maybe the 5% if they can get a little bit of their amounts. And likewise, Colorado River water coming, it's 25 to 30%, somewhere in that range of urban Southern California's water. So the biggest source of water in urban Southern California is local water supply still. Groundwater, which is why it's so important to protect groundwater resources in Southern California. It's also a lot less energy intensive, and therefore greenhouse gas emission intensive. So the more we can use local sources, the less impact we have on a lot of other systems and on air emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. So those systems, I think, are here to stay, but how much we use out of those and how we use it is an interesting question. And again, to kind of go back to Gary's theme, price is going to matter. So the water sold through those systems combined in Southern California is on the order of $1,000 per acre foot. If there are other sources that are less expensive than that, local sources or water trades through that, then that's worth taking a hard look at, and that's exactly what's going on. So people are looking pretty hard at all the different options on the portfolio, and price is really the driving issue there, along with the environmental impacts.
I wanted to follow up too on this point that both Bob and Arturo mentioned about urban landscaping. So I lived in Tucson for a long time. And if you've been to Tucson, it looks like a desert city. It is a desert city. It's dusty. It also has a very steep block pricing system and a very high one. It was one of my family's highest monthly budgets, other than air conditioning, for water. Phoenix, which is a very similar, larger, but nevertheless demographically very similar and in so many other ways similar place. If you go there, it looks like an oasis city. And you want to predict what the water pricing system there is? It's a flat rate system, and it's far lower than Tucson's. And so you don't get the same incentives for urban residents to change their landscaping. In Tucson, no one came out, as they've done in Las Vegas, and told people to rip up lawns and put in cactus and whatever. People did that because there was either that or groceries. In Phoenix, the incentive is to continue to have lush landscaping, so it looks more like, well, like here, when it really is a desert city. So, and you can set these prices to protect the immediate small uses of water that Arturo and Jim were making reference to. For personal consumption, local household use, you can have that block pricing set fairly low and then have it move very quickly. But I'll post that on my webpage. There was a nice study sponsored by the National Science Foundation on pricing and per capita water use in Phoenix and Tucson, and I'll post that on my webpage.
You were sort of touching on the answer to my question, which is currently, given that agriculture uses 80% of water, are there any economic incentives to become more water use efficient on farms? Or is the cost of water just not high enough for there to be changes in water use, especially when it's more scarce?
Yeah, I can't speak to the economics of farming, but there's a very important legal twist to this, which I think a lot of you probably know, which is the appropriative use doctrine, which is essentially it's a use it or lose it. And so there's a real challenge for these farms that if they become more efficient and they reduce their water needs, it may be that they, and the case law is different depending on the state, but they risk actually losing their water rights. And so it's a perverse system in that regard if you care about water efficiency.
I just had a question. I've driven up the Central Valley of California many times, and you drive around at like high noon, and there are agricultural fields just spraying water left and right. Is there any feasible options for them right now, and is it really a water issue or more of like a political economics issue, do you think?
Well, so it's a pricing issue. I mean, some of the...
I'm shocked to hear you say that.
some of that water that you see is going to very high valued orchards and so forth, okay? And you have to give them water just to maintain the investment in this orchard. At some point, if water becomes too costly, then they tear them up. And some irrigation districts have fairly high priority. Jim mentioned water rights, and so they have them. And on the east side of the San Joaquin, the infrastructure is such you can actually trade water. So farmers routinely do that, and so it gets spread across. And so they have what that does is it tells them what they could get if they sold the water or leased it to somebody else. And so on the east side, it tends to move a lot more smoothly. The west side that you see along I-5 is quite different. The water rights are a lot less clear and certain, a lot less tradable, and the infrastructure isn't as conducive to moving water from one agricultural use to another, or for that matter, to other possible uses at this point. So you get quite sharp disparities in water prices in agriculture between the east and the west sides of the San Joaquin.
There's also a really interesting legal aspect to it. Shockers, I'm talking about the law. And that is the doctrine of waste. And if you're essentially not making beneficial use of the water, you lose the right. And it's an open question whether unlined irrigation ditches, for example, would constitute waste or not, or whether basically running the sprinklers at noon constitute waste. I'm not aware that those sort of standard practices, at least in California, have been held to basically give cause for losing property, to losing the right.
They haven't been tested yet. That actually is a constitutional provision that came in because the courts ruled that water use does not need to be reasonable, just beneficial. And the courts interpreted the law, and the people said, well, if that's the case, we'll change the law. And we changed the state's constitution in order to provide for requiring reasonable and beneficial use. But testing different use patterns like that or lining, some of the tests go to gravel mining and some other activities, but not to these use practices. I think we'll see some cases soon. Failure to implement best management practices, failure to do basic good management, especially when listed species are croaking as a result of those activities. I think that will trigger, so there'll be a combined ESA and Article 10.2 case. I predict we'll see that pretty soon.
You don't just mean croaking frogs.
No, right. The kind that don't make noise.
How would you see something like production of alfalfa in the desert as a reasonable use? Would it be?
I think that's a different test. I mean, one is just flat out waste, where you could now, growing any particular crop, and clearly people in the desert, alfalfa uses on the order of 7 feet of water for one crop. And we're exporting alfalfa to China right now in containers. There's various reasons for that, but one is the input costs are so low that it makes sense from an economic standpoint to do that. But how did we get there? How is it that water is priced that way and all the rest? So I think that, which crops are grown probably is a different question. You could interpret it through reasonable and beneficial use. Probably it's going to be interpreted through other means, would be my guess. So that probably wouldn't be the trigger for this kind of test of that doctrine. Or I should say, I think if it went, I think it would probably not be supported.
I saw an article online yesterday that related to the constitutional prohibition of wasting water. And it was spraying vineyards, grapevines, with water to prevent them from freezing. And that was, that was cited as something that was really going to be significant. Did you see that, and do you have any comments on that sort of thing? And again, this was not irrigation, it was spraying when they could be doing something else like putting fans in them.
Yeah, frost protection actually is a big use of water in the vineyards relative to the uses in the vineyards, but vineyards tend to be pretty thrifty in terms of bang for the buck and the crop and so forth. When I was a kid, they had systems of what were called smudge pots. You may remember, black pollution, deliberately creating air pollution to protect the crops, and big fans. And frost protection now, spraying water on the vines is a simpler way, and obviously doesn't have all these environmental negative environmental impacts. From my sense, that's a completely reasonable and beneficial use of the water, and when you add that to irrigating the crop, you're still at much lower levels. The issue there, though, is it tends to be in places like the Russian River Valley and so forth, where there are flashier systems, and so you end up with shortages pretty quickly in water. So there are obviously questions of how to manage water so you have enough for frost protection, and the frost, this is only basically from winter into spring when they're budding out. That's the only time that's a concern. If they frost, then you lose the crop. And so it's a fairly short duration period where they do that, and only when they have frost conditions. So it's actually not that big a use of water. And interestingly, they're using a lot of recycled water now in those vineyards, both for frost protection and for irrigation. You know, in a lot of those areas, which is, I think, a good use of recycled water.
Thanks. The first question you got was something like, how have you seen the effects of the drought? I think most of you said it hasn't really affected you, but I do the shopping for my family. And I've noticed this steady rise in the price of eggs. I eat beef, I admit it, ground beef, and milk. And I've attributed this to the drought, and I'm just curious if there's any data to back that up.
Good question. I doubt, frankly, that the drought effects, I mean, it's hard to kind of separate out. I mean, California's enacted a variety of sort of animal raising, you know, for eggs and chickens and so forth, and other regulations that play into that. My suspicion is that the drought effects are not there yet in pricing, or a variety of things driving these things up. As was mentioned earlier, one more year, and then the drought effects, especially for crops that don't ship well across long distances. Crops that are tradable from Mexico and other places, the localized drought effects will not show up much in prices. But for localized things, they'll start to creep up in a hurry.
But I would expect that fruits, particularly because those are not getting the watering that they should be getting, the yield is going to be lower, so that's going to be affected fairly significantly. Not so much because the price went up, but just because the yield was down, and so now they have to try to recoup that. There's other factors. For example, beef is affected by the other meats like pork and all that, and pork had a big impact, so that's affecting the price of some of these other ones because as you didn't have that production, people are buying more beef, more demand, then that supply price go up. So it's complicated.
So you guys talked about the importance of groundwater with our current status in our drought. Can you guys talk about what kind of pushback has happened against fracking and what you think the future of fracking will be in California?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that, unbeknownst to most of us, even myself, who I follow a lot the water quality field, fracking has been going on in California for a long time, at least a couple of decades, in different forms and to different extents, and even in other parts of the world. It's been improved in the last few years, particularly because of the work that was done in the shales up in Ohio, River Valley, in that area, in Pennsylvania. But there's a lot of fracking, and there's many different ways of doing fracking. You can do it really poorly and really make a big mess, or you can do it well and it's quite containable. I would still rather see ourselves shifting away from fossil fuels, so I'm not promoting that fracking gets done because I would rather we find other sources of energy. But I think you can, if that's one way you're going to get to the oil, you can do it. It does have the water impacts at the very beginning where you're doing the development of the well. So at that point, it will be a significant amount of water that's needed to frack the well. And then after the first 6 months, then that decreases significantly, and sometimes there's a need to go back and do a few. So in some places, you do see significant challenges. And it's a water use that they have the money to be able to pay for purchasing water from others. So it has an effect on the water availability around the area because they can buy that water. So it can have those impacts.
What do you guys think about the emergency funding coming down from the governor to help with drought conditions? And do you think this drought will have an effect on long-term use, changing essentially business as usual, depending whether or not we actually get rain next winter from so-called El Nino.
Yeah, the state moved through very quickly a bill the governor signed for $687 million, I think, for drought response. And I was actually quite pleased with what was thrown out of that bill before it got through and what stayed in. And most of what's in it right now is integrated water management strategies and a lot of good near-term efforts that have long-term benefit as well. So amping up the recycling, improving water use efficiency, so forth. So if that's how the money is spent, if it comes through and it's still in process, I think a lot of good long-term value will come from that, as well as short-term drought response. But it's always a feeding trough. You know, I mean, $687 million for California is not that much money, but it's enough money to fight over. So we'll see how it actually gets spent. But so far, I've actually been impressed with what's in it.
Some long-term climate models are saying that the drought we're having now isn't an occasional drought like in the past. In fact, it is the new normal. What's the status of things like conservation and even groundwater? In fact, California and the whole West just gets a lot less rain in the next 100 years.
I think we don't know if it'll be the new normal, but I think we do need to think that it could be the new normal, and I think that's the thinking at this point, that we really need to start thinking about planning for the short, medium, and long term if, in fact, we do have a lot more of that going on. If we do have a lot more drive, then we need to be prepared for that, and I think that's what's the important message there.
I think we can also learn from more arid states. Arizona is far ahead of California in many ways in terms of groundwater management, and you would expect that because this is a state with almost no surface water. So there's a lot to learn, but there are a lot of places we can learn from.
Australia, for example.
Yeah, we really need to start thinking about whether or not we cycle wet next year or dry. And it's very clear from the science that it's going to get wetter or drier. We really don't know for California. There's a lot of uncertainty in the signal. On a global average, we expect more precip, but at any given place, and particularly California for various reasons, there's a lot of uncertainty. It could easily cycle back and forth, wets and dries. We need to think, what do we do under long-term drought cycles? So the 77 drought was 2 years, but very dry, acute, very similar to this one. The late 80s, early 90s was about 5 years, not quite as acute, but longer term. You've got to think through, how do you manage resources under those kinds of scenarios? And what if it was 10 years and not 5? What kinds of things would we need to think about? And probably similar to the valuation on other commodities, how do you develop signals to people that are meaningful, that you have scarcity and you really need to think longer term? We don't have the systems in place yet to do that. I think we're going to need to give serious thought to how to do that. And then when we cycle wet, how do you capture and store it?
Where do you
So
store
we've got millions of acres of groundwater storage potential right now. In urban Southern California, 3 or 4 easily. A hole in the ground sitting there right now we can recharge, and huge amounts in the Central Valley. But we're overdrafting so much that we're collapsing aquifers, so we're losing storage space right now. We need to think hard about the value of that kind of underground storage space in those long-term scenarios. You probably want to figure out ways to fill it up and hang on to it so you've got it in those drought cycles. And right now our laws are not facilitating that. We need to rethink the legal structure on that.
So I guess this question is a little bit more directed to you, Gary, but just as far as the two major classic doctrines of California water rights, the use it or lose it doctrine and the right seniority doctrine, can you talk a little bit about how those kind of affect the difficulties with water trading in California? Especially the seniority issue seems to me to really make it difficult to value what your water right is. Because if you have a junior right, it depends on so many factors.
It certainly impacts junior right holders. You're right to point out are more at risk in terms of the amount of water they have. So they might be less active. I think that's a prediction you could test. They might be less active in a water market because there's less certainty how much water they'll receive. Higher priority rights holders would be, I think, very active in water markets, and we could empirically examine that. It seems like a testable implication. And for those parties, I don't think, well, I mean, they have high priority, so they have quite a bit of certainty about the amount of water they're going to get. Most Western states use the same water rights regime. So the smoothness or the ease in which water moves under this priority system in part depends on the regulatory process. And so what that is concerned with is the impact on lower priority folks and return flows. If that process is reasonably well defined so that if there's a proposed water trade and it could have third-party effects, especially to lower rights holders, that is all part of what the regulatory process is supposed to deal with, and then they can constrain the amount of water that's traded or provide some compensation or something. If the process is less well-defined so that standing is quite broad, so that not just lower rights holders, but almost anyone can contest a water right, then the whole thing bogs down. And California is more on that extreme than some other states, for example, New Mexico, and in some ways Colorado in terms of having a clear water rights trading regulatory process than just California.
So following on that, you all agreed that this enhancing the ability to trade water rights seems like a really important thing to have happen. And you mentioned the east side of the San Joaquin where they have a better system of doing that. Why is that? Is it on county by county? Does it take state action? How does that end up being sort of a patchwork on one side of the river and not working on the other side?
The east side tends to be the higher priority rights holders. These are smaller irrigation districts. The west side is largely wetlands, the largest irrigation district in California, and its water is junior, and it's mostly Bureau of Reclamation water, which means that it's just a lot more certain. And since on the east side you have these small irrigation districts and they have ditches running from one another and to various water sources, there's the conveyance system is put into place. With wetlands, that isn't so much the case. Because wetlands rights are not so clearly defined, it's just, usually wetlands is trying to buy water desperately, whereas on the east side of the San Joaquin, they're willing buyers and willing sellers, so it moves a lot more smoothly.
Do you think we'll ever see a change in how water rights are legally set up in the state of California? Is there any precedence in other places for these sorts of changes to really balance the system a little bit better? Especially I'm thinking about agriculture being such a huge player in California, and they have the water rights. So if they have a strong lobby, what would be the likelihood of there being really any political change to see this motivate in the future?
Well, it depends what you mean by changing the water rights system. If the notion is that we want to use water more efficiently, move water more readily to other uses so that 80% or whatever isn't devoted solely to agriculture, it's in everybody's interest for that to happen. Now, not all water will go from agriculture, be the marginal water. If farmers have the ability or irrigators have the ability to share in the gains from that exchange, I see that happening. If it seems more arbitrary in the sense that it's viewed more as, in the sense that Jim can talk about, a taking, then you'll see heels dug in and political battles, and nothing good will happen very fast. So that would what we would want to avoid, it seems like, and find ways that are more collaborative so we can move smoothly and quickly to address, because droughts happen quickly, and we want to address them quickly, and so we want to process this smooth and not contentious.
I'd say quickly, it's slow going, but I do see a lot of changes. If you look at the courts, and the courts have been very important in the changes occurring, rather than say a deliberative process, people sitting around saying, what's a better way to do this? And we tend to do it. Instead, we tend to fight over it, and judges make some rules. But the Audubon case on Mono Lake was seminal with the public trust doctrine, which essentially said that these water rights, the appropriative doctrine, we also have the riparian doctrine in California, and the Pueblo doctrine, but all of those water rights that are set up through those doctrines and legal understandings are all bound by a longer-term public trust responsibility in California, and other states have adopted. Some have well, some have rejected that. What that means is that kind of the environment's coming in the back door. And whereas we did not have legal protections for a lot of environmental purposes for the most of the California's history, we do now. And clarifying what that means, especially in relation to endangered species and the rest, is a painful, slow process, but we're getting a shift in the way we actually use water law and water rights that is building environment back into it. It's not a very efficient process. It's clumsy. It's not economically efficient. It's not politically efficient, but we're kind of bouncing our way there. This, what I mentioned, groundwater law, what we're seeing right now in Sacramento, the last few weeks and I think the next couple of months, will be a seminal shift in an effort, and I'm reasonably optimistic, to actually get a grip on statewide groundwater law that we have not had through the whole state's history. That'll be a big deal. Again, it's incremental, but I think we're getting there.
See, unlike other commodities, utility commodities like gas or electricity or even cable TV, water is provided in a much more decentralized, distributed and sold in a much more decentralized way, even here on the South Coast. First of all, if the drought were to continue into next year, any sense of whether the state could compel local water providers to work together more cooperatively to provide water or manage water? And then in the longer term, do you see any movement here or anywhere in California toward more regionalization of water management?
Well, that's a tough one. No, I think the state does not want to get into the situation of telling locals what to do, and for a lot of good reasons. On the other hand, a lot of locals are saying, please help us cooperate with each other, and it's going to take, something from on high to incentivize or encourage that. I see probably more prospect for encouragement for that sort of thing through the IRWIMPs and so forth than mandates. The governor actually does have emergency powers, and they're pretty strong, should he choose to use them. But there are a lot of politics involved in doing that. So they've taken 2 rounds already of these executive orders that he's come through with. But they could go a lot further under California law should he choose to do that. That's a good question. I don't know where we'll end up with the state trying to tell the locals what to do versus the locals asking for help.
One more question?
I was just wondering, can you identify any longer-term conservation trends with like urban water suppliers, or is it mostly reactive to drought?
I mean, there's a lot of interesting work going on right now that's somewhat related to stormwater management. That's a huge area of interest of a lot of cities right now. And it's sort of the greening of the sort of green urban infrastructure, right? So for example, trying to put in structures that actually collect a lot of the stormwater and let it saturate the soils rather than just running it off somewhere. And this ties into what Arturo was talking about earlier, and Bob, if you want to increase the groundwater storage capacity, then those two are actually very closely linked, even though you often think of them as very different things.
I think if you look at even the natural trend, the amount of water that we use has not increased as much as the population growth for a number of years, actually for over a couple of decades. So there are conservation measures that have been going into place and trying to restore the way the whole hydraulic system works. So that's been going on, but I think we need to accelerate it, and I think these droughts really sort of push put the pressure to actually get that going and do more of that, and I think that's important.
So I think we're just about out of time, but I guess if you have any parting thoughts or things that maybe we didn't cover, we've covered a lot of information here, but I'd just like to hear from the panel, kind of a closing statement if you have one.
From my view, I think it's what I said earlier, which is there's a real crisis here. I mean, the way you get, if you look at the sort of history of U.S. environmental law, almost inevitably the major statutes follow a perceived crisis. And what you have is a real crisis. And so I'm not at all surprised to hear that Bob is saying that there's sort of a seminal moment right now to move on groundwater. And it would be totally in keeping with the history of U.S. environmental legislation that you would see something big come out of this. And so the sort of as an observer, my sense is don't waste the moment.
Mm-hmm. And I think, we've seen many cases where changes in the legal system drive innovation. So I think that's the other thing that will come out of this, that we will have a lot of innovation in how we manage it technologically, and even markets to come up with better solutions for this. So I think it's exciting.
Just closing thought, I think the upside of this, because it can get kind of gloomy when you think about drought, all the bad things that can happen. As we think about opportunities, we can do much better with water use, and doing that gives us energy benefits, emission reduction benefits, ecosystem restoration benefits. So getting more thoughtful about integrated solutions, the kind of stuff we try to work on here at Bren, I think leads to some thinking that's quite different, that one ways out is not just surviving, but doing things that are smarter and better and builds resilience and a more sustainable approach to the future. So I think that's where our focus ought to lie.
And I'm going to end with leaping into groundwater. They only, until recently at least, of the 400 or so groundwater basins in California, only 23 of them had the water rights adjudicated. That is actually measured so that this wasn't just a common pool resource. And so I'm hopeful that the greater pressure on groundwater will lead to greater action to make water rights clear to groundwater, so that people aren't thinking of this as a common pool resource that any party can draw from and deplete.
I'd like to thank everybody for attending today, and I'd like to thank our panel for their time. This was a really good conversation.
And again, let's thank Jim for putting all this together. Woo!